Oh,
Hello.
happy part of your day. What time is it at your place?
12:30 here in the afternoon.
Almost lunchtime.
Yeah, just finished eating actually.
Oh.
Early lunch.
Hmm. Oh, well, I just opened the notes. The last notes were from August 29, 2024. So 6 months ago or so.
It's been a little while.
Let's wait a couple minutes more for Dennis. I know Benji is going to be late, but I think Dennis is joining. Ah, here he comes.
Hello. Sorry, I'm on my
Hello.
phone, so I'm joining a bit late.
No worries at all. I was wondering if I was pronouncing your name right. Is it Dennis?
Dennis, yeah, it's Dennis. It's actually like with a long E, so it's like Dennis, you know? But yeah,
Dennis.
Dennis or Dennis, whatever works for me. You can take
Sound-
any way of pronunciation of my name.
Sounds good.
Hello, folks. How are we doing?
Hey, Benji.
Hello.
We haven't started actually. Like we were just warming up.
Oh, wonderful. Dennis, I know you've got a pull request open. For some reason, CLA bot doesn't like it, which makes no sense.
Yeah,
I've tried.
could have been all of the things I've done to get the Guildsbot signed. Maybe I
Right.
clicked authorized and then under my account, I mean, and then it somehow unauthorized me or whatever happened. But I've signed the CLI again. I don't know whether the bot updates automatically. It seems not to. I did
I
the
think
same
you
for.
might need to click that link in that specific issue and then follow the.
That's exactly what I did.
Oh, then it should update itself, but
Okay.
yeah.
Maybe push like a phantom commit or something. Yeah, I'll handle that.
Okay.
Weird.
All right.
Weird.
Either way, we know that you've signed it in the past because you've been in previous meetings, so we'll
Yes, of
carry on
course.
ahead anyway. Okay, I guess I'll get us started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GraphQL over HTTP working group. We all have agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, links to all of which can be found in the agenda. We'll start with an introduction of attendees, and we'll go Benji, Martin, Shane, and then Dennis. So starting with me. Hello, everyone. My name is Benji.
Hello, I'm Martin.
Hello, I'm Shane Kruger with GraphQL.net.
Hello, I'm Dennis from the guild.
Lovely. Thank you all. I thought I'd just call you out because there's so few people and Dennis isn't on the list. It would be great to have someone helping to take notes. The link to the live notes is in the agenda file itself. So you can click that. Everyone can contribute. I think it's going to be an active discussion between all of us. So let's try and all contribute to the notes when we can. To make space for everyone else to talk. That would be great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to have a quick look at the action items just to see if there are any. There's none that are ready for review. And there is one that is an action item that's active, but we're going to cover that in topic 7 shortly, so I'll skip over that for now. Looking at the agenda, we will be talking about the watershed and also the spec status. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add to the agenda for today? Okay, lovely. In which case, I will hand over to you, Martin, for the watershed.
Oh, so I'm doing this. Okay. I added it mainly as a reminder because there's been a bunch of discussion. Let me revive that link. Where is it? It's pull request number 322 that you open, Benji. I'm going to paste the link here. That proposes to move the watershed, I think, 5 years in the future to give us some time to adapt. So the watershed, trying to remember everything, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a moment when all servers are required to support the new content type. I think that's it. And so the ongoing discussion, like I wasn't a huge fan of this initially because 5 years sounds like a very large time. And so to cut to the important bit there, my question is, why do we even need the watershed? Like if we decided to release the spec now, like could we just remove it from the principle that most servers by now should support it?
I'll speak to this. So the aim that we agreed on for the version 1 of this spec to get it out was to describe broadly the status quo of what GraphQL HTTP servers have done since its launch, pretty much, to maybe turn off a few of the iffier things, but to increase compatibility by describing precisely what they did. And none of them, until quite recently, have used this new application GraphQL response plus JSON media type. So this is something that was actually new to this spec as kind of a feature of here's a reason, here's a thing that allows us now to use HTTP status codes in a limited way. But given that this is a draft specification, no one really has had to implement it at this point. And given that we previously agreed that V1 was meant to capture the status quo, I feel uncomfortable pushing out this new requirement that makes every GraphQL server that was released in, let's say, 2020 automatically not compliant. That wasn't the aim of this. So I think waiting for this to come out as a release and then giving people time to move over would be the preferred approach. The reason this has happened is because I think originally I was expecting this to be approved quite quickly as a spec, because it basically did what the previous spec did, tidied a few things up, clarified a few things. And then I can't remember how long I said it in advance for the watershed, but it was like 2 years, maybe something like that, which I thought was reasonable. But, and we're kind of getting onto the next topic a little bit, we've got held up over a few things, such as talking about the security features, or talking about security at all, which we need to do to get this spec over the line. And it's not, that work hasn't been done yet. So it might be a while before this spec is ready for its 1.0 release. At some point, we then want to expand it anyway with other features such as the variable batching, request batching, persisted documents, also talking about the way of handling like subscriptions through WebSockets or server-sent events, or whether that be calling out to another spec or whatever. There's a whole load of things that we want to do once this V1 is out, but we need to get to V1 being out first. So broadly, my feeling is let's extend the watershed to improve the compliance with our original aims.
Could we change the original aim? Like, I guess there's a tension between we want to describe the status quo and we want to also add something like security and batch variables and other stuff. Feels like the original aim is not what we are after now.
I think if we don't require application GraphQL response plus JSON, instead we just recommend it, which is already the case, then the majority of GraphQL servers that have been written since 2015 will still be pretty much compliant with this, or will not require significant effort to make compliant. Dennis, you've written the test suite for this. You tested back in the day like as many servers as you could get your hands on. Would you agree that most were pretty close to already aligned with the spec at that time, or not?
So they were compliant in terms of the requirements. All of the musts were implemented, but the shoulds weren't. So there are the recommendations, basically not all of the servers follow. There is only like a handful that are like 100% compliant and will stay as such once the watershed has passed. But I opened a PR where I have increased the requirements from the previous recommendations to the current requirements, and at least 3 of them dropped from the list, which led to this discussion because it might be unfair of sorts to like be so harsh about it, following the fact that the HTTP spec is still a draft and that there wasn't a lot of attention around it. And also adding to what Benji said, where it's not a release yet. It's still an ongoing discussion around things that might move around the spec. So it could be that we are forcing people to do something that we are not even fully behind yet. So that's something that I also agree to push it forwards. I also think that the current requirements, meaning that at one point in time we require the new content type, should stay as is. we should not change our direction of what we're aiming and what our goals are with it. I think that the way we designed the spec at aiming for the future is something that increases not only the security but also like compliance and changing the and following the conventions with HTTP itself. So it's something that we want to push people to do, but it might be too harsh already doing the switch right now because of like people are just not aware of it. And I think once it reaches a release state, that a lot more intention will be around it, and therefore the next watershed will make sense.
I'd also like to point out, and thank you, Dennis, that was very well put. I'd also like to point out that there's a lot of GraphQL servers out there that people have just rolled themselves. Serving GraphQL over HTTP is relatively straightforward, right? You just accept these parameters via JSON, you execute GraphQL, you serialize it as JSON, and you send it back again. And you make sure the relevant header is here and there. That's basically it. So I think a lot of people have used that old serving over HTTP page that we had on the GraphQL.org website since 2015 and just built their own. We would effectively be making all of those invalid by pushing this out as a must from the very start. And that means that any clients that want to say, oh, the GraphQL over HTTP spec says that this is now required, so I no longer need to support this old code path. I only need to support this new one because they all have to be compliant. Effectively means anyone using those old servers may not be able to use the latest versions of Apollo client, Urkel, Relay, whatever wants to upgrade to this latest version. So I think pushing it a fair ways out and giving people time to migrate would be wise. I'd also say that the benefit of making this a must is quite minimal. I'd say it's really minimal. The difference is like clients before then should also add application/JSON to their accept header. That's broadly the issue, and they should be able to accept just JSON rather than GraphQL response plus JSON in their response body. That's really all it is, and that's not really going to save much on bundle size, for example. It's not a huge thing. So I'd rather keep as many people compliant as possible and push the goalpost for this significantly in the future so that we can be confident that this is something that almost every server will have been able to support. And I think 5 years from now or 3 years from release is a reasonable time to do that. Shane.
Couple comments. I was thinking that technically a server today that does not support the new media type would actually not meet this specification, because on the watershed date, whether it's 2025 or 2030, it would not switch. And as such, I think it might be a little misleading to say that legacy servers would immediately support this, as your original goal. Like, well, the 1.0 is a spec that all the servers currently conform to if they're not going to do the auto switchover, in my mind. So this whole comment. Another one is that the server after the watershed is still required to support the old header. So maybe there is some, like, maybe we should consider something in the middle between the watershed that is a difference between the server's implementation and the client's implementation. Let me explain that a little bit better. Like, for example, maybe we require immediately, for example, that servers need to support the new content type, and that they use that as the default when none is provided. However, we require clients until 2030 or whenever to send using both content types. And therefore, we're in a sense, alienating less servers, because any legacy server then is guaranteed to be supported till the watershed, even though you are favoring the new content type. I mean, on the other hand, you could say, well, clients are required to send the content type, so what difference does it make? That's just another I thought I had. That's it. Any thoughts to that?
I generally like the idea of clients sending the accept header with the wish media type. I don't necessarily agree that they should be put both, because then the server can decide which one to serve. So once the watershed passes, they can just switch and maybe break clients. I would recommend that we send a message to clients to attach the media type that they wish to use. So at the moment, they want to use the application JSON and use the 200 status codes. So let's like have all of the clients do that. And once the watershed passes, nothing will break. Everybody will have time to upgrade if they want to.
Just so you know, the spec currently mandates that the server follow the HTTP spec, which will follow a prescribed order of supplied media types based on the quantity. And that's I read the entire spec before our call here, that it's as of currently, any compliance server is required to follow the order and quality and whatever pursuant to HTTP spec. So it's not up to the server to decide that if it's compliant.
But if it doesn't support the first content type, trying to make sure I understand, like if there's an accept header with two content types, the server has to serve them in order. Is that what you say?
It's not exactly that. There's a queue parameter which sets your preferred weighting for each one. By default, everything is weighted the same. So you, as the server, if you have two things that are weighted the same, you may choose which one you respond with. But to your point, Dennis, when a client issues both, it's saying, I support both. So a server changing and giving you one response in one request and a different one in the next request shouldn't break the client. It should be able to handle both of those. So changing at a point in time in the future shouldn't cause any client breakage. If it would break the client shouldn't say that it supports both.
I'm just following the assumption that people expect HTTP status code to be 200 most of the times on the client. So like conveying the message that they should use the media type and switch when they're ready to support the new one as well. That will be something for the client to decide, but not to ignore the media type. So the message was, let's put it simply, so the message should be just use the accept header. So it could be just that. And then people already supporting the new media type can use the new one. And the people that are either unsure or have been using it conventionally for the past years, they just use the application JSON type and they basically do the same.
We could just get rid of the watershed entirely and the spec would still be useful, right? Effectively, it recommends that you use the media type that allows you to use HTTP codes, but you can just use the old ones if you want to. I added the watershed as a way of effectively not having to support the legacy patterns forever. And it was, at the time, I wasn't sure whether people would go for it or not, but it seems actually people are quite keen on it and want the watershed as soon as possible, which is interesting. I've forgotten my other point.
We have had feedback that that users are doing so too.
Oh, I remembered what my other point was. The other thing is, as Martin points out, like if we aren't 100% like this isn't a published spec yet. We might still change things. And one thing that I think that there is a chance of us changing is a new status code for partial success, which doesn't really exist in the HTTP spec itself. The closest that I could find previously, and I forget what the code for it was one of the WebDAV, I think it was partial response or something like that, but it very specifically relates to WebDAV. So I think if we were to have one, we would need to just create a new HTTP code ourselves, like people have done before. And I think a partial response code would actually be quite useful. One of the main things about this spec is this media type allowing us to use HTTP status codes isn't really to enable the clients to do something else, because the clients can already infer everything from the response that they receive. If they've got the right accept header and they've got the data and errors, then they know what has happened, whether it's a partial response, whether it's success, whether it's failure. So the HTTP codes aren't really there to help clients. They shouldn't add anything that a client can't already ascertain from the response. They're there to help intermediate systems. They're there to help your proxies, your intrusion detection systems, your logging, any intermediary that you've got between the server and the client that needs to know whether this was a successful request or not. That's what it's there for. And at the moment, even partial requests are required to be 200s, or I can't remember whether I think it might be 2xx that we've required rather than 200 exactly. But having a partial status code would be useful for those intermediaries to know whether they want to log. For example, the rate of errors coming through our responses is increased, even though they're still partially successful, there are more errors coming out of them. That kind of tracking, which would be easier to do if we had a different status code for that. So that's one other thing we might want to add before we publish this spec. Dennis, would you say that you agree with what I said there? Because I think previously you mentioned about potentially breaking the clients when we start using the status codes. Do you think it's likely that clients might start depending on the status codes of responses?
I'm not sure. So generally, when you approach writing clients that do anything over HTTP, you almost always check whether it's a okay response status. So only by doing that, the only thing that might break is that, if you don't do error handling on the other status codes. So if you expect all of the errors to come through as successful responses, and then read the body and see what the errors field says, and then decide whether there are errors or no. And if there's any 4xx or 5xx, you just ignore and say server exploded or whatnot. That's where the clients may break, not being able to correctly convey what the error is behind the response. But I don't think that they would break in any other sense. So I think conventionally, exactly because you've been checking the status codes for 200s before forwarding that request to your application, I think that's true everywhere.
It's a really good point. It's also a really good reason why we shouldn't use 400 and 500 status codes for partial success. Partial success should be success, but rather than failure with some goodness. Yeah. So if an error was to happen, it would only ever be one that did not have data and only had errors. So handling that as an error would be acceptable. It's just not quite as good as it had before. It's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
I think that's the only So we generally recommend the 2XX status code, but I think only when there is no errors field set and there is data, do we recommend exactly the 200 status code in the spec. I might be wrong, but I think that's the case.
That's probably the case because that's what's in my head, and I wrote a lot of this latest version. And specifically, I wanted to leave space for a partial response status code, so that's why I did it. But yeah, if that's not the case, we should change it so that it is. The other thing is, to your point of those errors coming through, and of clients saying we support this new status code, one of the risks here is that people tend to only test the success paths. They tend to say like, oh, does it render this page fine? Does it render this fine? Does it do that fine? It doesn't often check what happens on an error. So it might be that when they check that it works with this new media type, they're only ever checking 200 responses anyway, and they just don't think to check things that might result in a 400. It might even be quite hard for them to generate a request that would generate a 400 in a test suite. Like it might be that it requires, for example, a 503 server downtime or something like that, that just doesn't exist in their test suite. So yeah, it's an interesting point.
There's actually a note in here about 247 partial success. I'm just looking at what's in there now.
Yeah, so it looks like past me did some research into this. It might be that we actually need to talk to someone on the IETF and see whether adding a status code for partial success might make sense. Yeah.
It would seem that that would be a recommendation or non-normative note if we did come up with something, or are you thinking it would be stronger than that?
We could, if we release the spec basically as is, then having it in an update with a recommendation, we recommend on partial success that you respond with this, I think would be good. However, I think it would be ideal if we could just have musts. In general, for interoperability, things work better if you're stricter. That said, being strict like that limits what you can do down the line. So for example, if someone wanted to say, if it's a validation error, I want it to be a 291. If it's a server downtime error, I want it to be a 292. If it's a whatever, I want it to be a 293. We would be forbidding that via the spec if we were to be too strict. So I don't know. We could go one way or the other. I think leaving it as it is and then putting a recommendation of a specific status code in a future release would be perfectly fine. It just means that tooling can't necessarily rely on that being the case.
And do you think that, I'm just trying to understand, are you thinking this would be applicable for any response with both data and error keys? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
I'm not sure what the situation.
If it has data as an object and not a null, and it has errors, which means it is a non-empty list because otherwise it wouldn't have it, then it should use a partial response status code once we've picked one, would be my recommendation.
And how would that be different than if data was null, indicating that no bubbling occurred and there were errors?
It's a good question. I personally would put that in the same bucket. However, traditionally, I think Express GraphQL, for example, treats that in the same way that it does when data is non-existent. And some systems struggle to differentiate the data null from data not present. So I think from a specification point of view, rather than if there's not a huge amount of value from that, then we could make compliance easier by basically allowing the server to choose how it wants to handle that special case. I personally, because I come from a JavaScript ecosystem and differentiating between present or not, undefined or not, null or not, and actually a value, so we have kind of 4 things, is perfectly fine. I'm used to doing all those things. But GraphQL is all about interoperability. So if it's going to be hard for some servers to implement that, I'm okay with there being a very specific special case for this.
Do you think maybe, if nothing else, it would be good to expand the current, no, non-normative note to, and yeah, it already says, so data as well as encountered errors. Okay, so it already covers the definition of when this might be applicable. So where there's data and errors. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
think it looks pretty good, actually.
I haven't read this again whilst on the call, but does it say in there that it must be a 200 if there are no errors, which is a thing I think you called out earlier? It doesn't seem to, from what I can see. We say it should. If the data entry is not null, then the server must reply with a 200, and it should reply with a 2xx, and it should reply with a 200. I think we should consider making it a must of a 200 if there are no errors and data is non-null, present and non-null.
Yeah, I'll just double check and see if I don't see that. That's fine with me. I do not see that it already exists. Okay, yeah.
Okay, this discussion has wandered a little. Let's move on to the next one, which we've partially covered anyway. But back to you, Buzz.
Yeah, it's a bit the same discussion, and we answered it already. I think my thinking about this a bit more, I think my question is more like there is no spec at the moment. Like there is no specification for transport. So when we're saying we are breaking servers, we are not really breaking anything, like because the status quo isn't written anywhere. So we have a chance now to have a clean page, and what we write in the spec doesn't mean it's what everybody is going to do from day one. I mean, we could probably release something, and the server would continue working as before, just instead of describing the status quo, it would be more describing the North Star of where we want to be, which also has some value because it makes things simpler to explain to the community at large.
I think it's relevant too that every single client that includes the accept header is going to work after the watershed as written currently. So we're talking about a very small subset, or I'd like to know if I'm wrong, that there's actually a large client base that does not send an accept header that you'd be alienating by making the change. I mean, I think that's sort of an important question here.
As in does not send the new media type or any media type?
Any media type. Because if it sends one at all, and it sends application JSON, it's going to get a response after the watershed is still guaranteed to return a response that is the same as it would today.
Yeah, so if the clients use the accept header and they use either just the application JSON or are weighted correctly to prefer the one that they actually support, I don't think anything will break after the watershed. Even if they don't fully support it but claim to do so, the only thing that they might break is the error handling. In terms of whether clients often provide the accept header, I think it depends on in like how much hurry you are. So like GraphQL has a very low level entry point and a lot of junior developers jump in and just set stuff up. And I think that when we are considering those level of knowledge, people often overlook the accept header and they just straight up don't use it. They expect like if they get a 200 response code that the body is parsable and that it works. This is basically like when I was starting, I did the same thing. So getting yourself familiar with the accept header like uh, comes after in your development days. And because GraphQL is as such, any like it's very interesting, it's very popular, and people want to use it. It sounds good, and since we didn't have a transport specification before, people didn't follow any conventions aside from like copy pasting code or expecting or sending responses as they see fit. So I think that it would be worth noting to recommend clients to still send the accept header so that they are safe after the watershed, or we just keep the shoulds and yeah.
One of the types of client that doesn't often send the accept header is command line scripts. Like people will often hack a script together using like JQ, for example, like a bash curl piped through JQ. And they often won't set an accept header because it's just like it's more characters to type and people just don't think about it. If I can send curly braces double underscore type name to my server and it works, then that's it. My script is good. Let's go. I'm actually okay with changing the rules to say that you're not a valid GraphQL client if you don't send an accept header after the watershed. At the moment, we allow for all clients to never bother sending an accept header and for the server to decide what to do. And the server can reject it both before and after the watershed. All we do is we change a should from it should pretend it's JSON to it should pretend it's GraphQL JSON. But really, the server can reject it before and after the watershed, or do what it wants before or after. If you don't send an accept header, then the server can choose what to do. So I guess the question really is, if you're not sending an accept header, are you really a GraphQL client? And we could say that as part of this spec, we'll just say no. You're just a random, you're just a random client trying to do stuff. And to be a GraphQL client, you must set an accept header.
Yeah, I would be in favor of that, but I do it immediately. I would make that part of the immediate requirements. It's going to assist in the future as anything changes.
Yeah. Dennis, do you have any tests that test clients? And do you know whether any of the, well, all of the main clients have traditionally sent accept headers?
So traditionally, the clients that you would find in the JavaScript ecosystem, they leave the transport part to you. Like Relay does that. They don't care how you do the transport. I'm not familiar with how, I think that all of the clients out there have a separate thing you have to plug in to make it work over HTTP. Whether they all use the accept header, I can't say for certain. I just know for a fact that Relay doesn't have any form or pluggable transport thing that they offer. And I don't test clients. I really haven't figured out a way of really testing clients, because testing servers is easy. You start it, and then you can use basically fields that are available in any GraphQL schema, which is just the underscore type names, uh, and test the server without a lot of configuration. But testing clients is a lot of work, because you have to like make sure it does things. So whether we want to test clients, I don't know. The idea of adding recommendation to provide the accept header is fine, but making it a requirement, as in the server not accepting and responding with 400 status codes if there is no accept header, I'm not really in favor of. Exactly because of what you said, Benji, is that like you have a lot of curls that just test stuff, and if you have to type extra characters, it's just a waste of time. I think it would be a general recommendation to have an accept header, but having none and having the server choose is something that we should stick with.
So the interesting question there is, does it matter if a curl script isn't a spec compliant GraphQL client? I don't think it necessarily does, so long as the spec itself allows a server to respond when there isn't an accept header, and doesn't say, if the client hasn't sent an accept header, you must reject this request.
Yes.
And normally what we do is we say, if it hasn't done the thing that is required of a spec compliant client, then it's up to you how you handle it, because it's not a GraphQL over HTTP request, so it's up to you. And if you want to process it as if it was, that's your choice. If you want to send an error, that's your choice. And I think if we stick with that from a GraphQL server point of view, like keep the server, allowing the server to be broad in terms of compatibility, but making sure that the client is strict in terms of conformance, might actually be the best bet. So those scripts just aren't valid GraphQL clients, but that doesn't mean they won't work. They just might not work.
Yeah.
I have one more idea, if I may. How about if we move the watershed back as you've previously recommended, or some point in between, but also make one change to the spec as written. And that is change it to require, as of today, that the server supports the new media type. And therefore, any server that wants to say, I'm a compliant GraphQL over HTTP server, I mean, they've seen the draft spec for the last couple of years, will immediately support the new type, and clients can start to gain those benefits immediately if they choose to do so. But you won't break any clients till whenever the watershed is, that don't send the accept header. How about that for an idea?
I don't think any clients, the only clients that will break after the watershed are clients that do, like Dennis says, the OK check, and they receive an error response saying that the request is invalid, not a partial response. So this isn't from a failed mutation or from an error that's happened during a field. This is where they've sent a query that isn't valid GraphQL to the server. And in those situations, they would previously have had a 200 because everything was 200. And now they might get a 400 client error. But that request was never valid or correct anyway, or the server's down, in which case, the server can't give you a response anyway. The client would already have handling code for the server being down, presumably. I don't think any legitimate traffic will be broken at the watershed for existing clients. So the only thing that adding that requirement that you just suggested in now is that it will make a whole bunch of existing GraphQL servers spec non-compliant. And
Correct.
I'm not sure that we want to do that. That wasn't the original aim. Maybe we should take a vote on it. And by all means, we can, if you feel strongly, like open an issue in the repository, and we'll get some chatter going on there about what people feel about it. But it doesn't align with the original aims of this specification. Which is fine. We can change those aims. We absolutely can change them. But like if we do, we want to make sure that everyone who's worked on it and who cares about it agrees to those changes.
Right. Yeah, it sounds great. Again, the original aim though was to release it quickly, and we just released a draft quickly, and it hasn't been ratified quickly. So that may affect how people feel about it.
Yep. Changing the subject back a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to the next GraphQL Foundation board meeting a small point for a moment, and I'm just going to ask everyone at the GraphQL Foundation board if they can have a look through their GraphQL traffic and see how many requests they're getting that don't have accept headers. That way we can try and get a sense for how common that specific use case is, because it does sound like we're operating a little bit in the dark here, and it would be good to have some actual concrete data on it. So I've tasked that to myself. I'll add that to the foundation board. For anyone else on this call, it would be great also if you could go and look through your own logs or your company's logs, or your colleagues, get your colleagues to look through their logs. It would be great to have some data points on this to know how many GraphQL requests are being served that do not have an accept header.
Could be interesting to get also an idea of the number of servers out there that already support the new media type while we are at it.
Yes, that would also be great. And I guess clients as well. So when people are looking at their headers, if they can look at the accepts and see whether they have the new media type in them, that would also be useful data. Okay, I want to pull us back to that final topic of spec status. The main, and I think possibly only thing that is preventing this spec from being ratified right now is that it's been said that the spec needs to contain some text relating to security. I can't remember the specific wording that was used, but basically we don't really talk about security in the spec as it is. We've basically said, well, it's over HTTP, so apply all your HTTP security best practices to it. But we probably need to add some spec text that basically says that, and also calls out some of the things that are specific to what we are doing. So for example, cross-origin resource sharing vulnerabilities caused by submitting through an alternative media type, such as the XWW form URL encoded or whatever it is. So some text about that. There is an open issue about it, and it is the action item that I mentioned earlier, which is issue number 280. So there needs to be some writing on it. I can't remember whether someone has already... Yeah, Shane has already opened a pull request with some text on this, and it has been discussed an amount. Does anyone know what the latest status of this is? Martin's approved it. Yovi's approved it. It's on me, isn't it? Okay, yeah. I will add this to my list of things to review soon. Because this is the main remaining thing I think that we need to get sorted, and then we can push it forwards. Okay, I'll take that as an action item on myself. Other than that, if anyone else can have a look at it as well and give any reviews, that would be really valuable. And Martin, I'll see you over the weekend. Everyone else, I'll
Yes.
see you. I'll see you next
Couple of
month,
days.
maybe. Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.